G'day. How are you going? Good. Can you understand my slightly weird Swedish-Australian accent, first of all? All right, just making sure that this slightly weird analog Swedish-Australian accent is being picked up by some of the analog or some of the digital radio antenna here in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get kick-started, I should just say that as a futurist, which basically means my mum has absolutely no idea what I do for a living. As a futurist, I'm also a little bit of a traditionalist, so it gives me a great pleasure to be here today to look at how tradition and technology really play together. Many of my futurist colleagues around the world today get super excited about all things virtual, all things cyber, all things artificial, all things cloud. Who remembers the good old days when cloud was just a meteorological term that blocked the sun here in London? You know, things used to be a bit simpler back in those days. They get excited about the fact that at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital today, more doctors and nurses trust the artificial intelligence of IBM's Watson over their human peers when it comes to cancer diagnosis in the oncology ward. They get excited about the 50% of jobs in the UK that will be up for automation and roboticization over the next 10 to 15 years. Turn to the person next to you, look them deep in the eye and go, "That's you." Even journalists are up for automation and roboticization today. And in many ways, these futurists, what they are doing is that they're swiping left on human intelligence and swiping right on artificial intelligence. For anybody on Tinder, you know exactly what I'm referring to here. If you're not on Tinder, please don't do your research, particularly if you're in a relationship. As a futurist, though, I am a bit of a traditionalist, and this is one of the things I want to talk to you about here today, marrying tradition and technology, the analog with the digital. So before we talk about the future, let me take you back on a historical journey for a moment in time. Let me take you back to my native Stockholm, Sweden. An urban vista back 100 years ago when things were a little bit simpler. They were a little bit slower. They were a little bit more black or white. And this was the black and white urban vista, a cityscape still vaguely untouched by vehicles, where people were still walking around, a place where people only wore black or white clothing, amazingly. Certainly no floral patterns had been invented quite yet. And this was the urban vista that greeted a man by the name of Georg Johansson, or the son of Johan, which sounds very Viking-esque, or as we'd say in Australia, George Johansson. All the Aussies in the audience totally got that. As the second oldest son on the family property, he had few inheritance rights, and as a result, he had to make his own commercial future in the cityscape of Stockholm. And his commercial opportunity after completing a retail apprenticeship for nearly 6 years was to take his life savings and invest them into his own bricks and mortar store. A bricks and mortar store designed for the increasingly sophisticated Swedish gentlemen of that era. And this was a time before YouTube, before Instagram husbands, selfies, even selfie sticks, when looking into camera was still very much of a technological novelty. And his business model was all about the bespoke, the hyper-personalization, the seasonally adjusted girth of the Swedish gentleman. It gets cold in winter time. And in a nod of approval to his provenance, as he became a man of commerce, he changed his surname from Johansson to the man from the southern farm, or Georg Sorman. He's my great-grandfather, and as you can tell, he must have been a little bit of a futurist because he's got an awesome haircut, a really cool little pocket square, and you can also see that we share some genealogical traits with North Korean dictators. He believed in the analog hearts and analog minds of yesteryear's customers by investing in things like the neon sign. But for my mum, Birgitta, the world of digital is now, as the third generation owner-operator of this little store, ruining her old school business model, threatening the heritage of a 101-year-old Stockholm institution. Because nowadays the customer will walk into the store, mum will pass down free intellectual property, tell them about the goods and mechanical and textile properties of her goods from Inishmaan off the coast of Ireland, or the Derek Rose, Pima, or mercerized cottons in the underwear she sells from Derek Rose. Her conversations with 3 generations of Derek Rose London textilers. The client will then say, hey, we'll think about it. And you know that they're not going to think about it. They then exit the store to the sound of a very, very lonely little bell out onto the street, around the corner, where they'll then order the item on Mr. Porter instead. The digital world, for my mum, as for so many other people around the world, is highly digitally disruptive. And my mum doesn't like change. And I think that's kind of humane, isn't it? Right? Change can be difficult. Who remembers puberty? Who's been through puberty? Okay. Has anyone ever tried changing a partner? And not necessarily like physically exchanging them for somebody else, because that can be very expensive, I know from personal experience. But rather selling them on the concept of paleo diets, long walks on the beach, home-cooked dinners. How does that pan out 21 days later after New Year's Eve? Change can be difficult, yet change doesn't really care whether we like it or not. It's always going to happen without our permission. And like so many other people today, the way my mum runs her business, the way she positions it, by focused so much on history, she runs the risk of not ensuring that there's a future for her business. The reality for her, like so many brands out there in the world today, is that she's perfectly prepared for a world that no longer exists. For the last 11 years, she's been artificially propping alive her business model, like so many other business models around the world today. And you can just imagine when you get a love letter from your son. I wrote this little love letter to my mum a few years ago called Digilog, How to Win the Digital Minds and the Analog Hearts of Tomorrow's Customers. Now, it has the ears of Fortune 500 CEOs around the world. One of our clients, Westpac Bank in Australia, credits this idea of the digital and analog fusing, with them moving from number 4 to number 1 on customer satisfaction in retail banking. Yet for me, the person I wrote this little love letter for has not yet read the book. Who just feels like you're part of a family therapy session so far? Okay. And can you imagine, by the way, how annoying it must be to have a son who's a futurist? Mum goes, couldn't you have stayed a lawyer in Melbourne at Clayton Utes instead? Things would have been so much easier from a family business perspective. She said, Anders, you should have become a lawyer, which I did, a banker, or a doctor. All professions these days that are being brutalized and affected by artificial intelligence, just like the automotive industry. No one's safe anymore, and just like robots and machines are doing to our brawns, artificial intelligence is increasingly doing to us as professionals, to our brains. And the future, of course, is not just about AI, it's also about EI, or emotional intelligence. For the last few years, I've been obsessing about how the analog world of tradition and the digital world of the future and technology, how they can intermingle. Certainly something that is critical when we think about man and machine, or woman and machine. The very essence of this idea of humanufacturing comes from the old term of manufacturing, which actually means to build by hand. And when we think of human as part of the humanufacturing equation, human also refers to some of our weaknesses. Because who does not feel safe when you drive to work because there's human apes behind the steering wheels? Or is that just me? Who sets their Waze or their GPS on a future target when you want to go to work or visit loved ones? Like you're pre-scheduling your plans to go somewhere. Does anyone do that? Yesterday when I went in Stockholm to Stockholm Airport at Arlanda Airport, of course, based on big data, I was able to tune into my Waze, which then gave me the optimum time based on big data analytics and heat mapping to see when I would actually get to Arlanda Airport. Imagine a future of smart cities, where smart cities and all of the red lights around the world are now tuned into smart sensors and your IoT, or Internet of Things enabled vehicles. So that, of course, the cities don't just work one way with Waze, but in fact they take the sensors and the real-time data and optimize the red, green, and amber lights based upon real-time usage patterns. This is the future we're entering into, a world of human and manufacturing, where the etymology also shows us that there's some weaknesses to what we do as humans. My first of two arguments here today is that now every business model, just like my mum's, is getting digitally disrupted at exponential rates, or at least it should be. Let me introduce you to one of my little heroes, little Max Harpham. He's 10 years of age, he lives on the North Shore in Sydney in Thornley, and is the 10-year-old son of one of my colleagues in our strategy think tank, Think, Emma Harpham, and her husband, Aaron Harpham. He's a cool kid, into his extreme sports, into his skateboarding, and as a football or soccer tragic, I can also proudly say that he was a top goal scorer of the under-9 Normanhurst Eagles last year. Now this gives me digital goosebumps because when this kid was born 10 years ago, he was born profoundly deaf. If a freight train went past his back, he would not be able to hear it through any analog signal whatsoever. But because of a great Australian innovation in biotechnology, the cochlear implant, of which he has two, implanted into his little brain, one behind each ear, he's able to have digital signal where there was no analog noise before. And the really cool thing is that once a year during the Australian Swimming Carnival, he's the only kid that can properly hear underwater. And if you find yourself in the exhibition booth later on this afternoon, leaning in to tune into some of the conversations with your right or your left ear, his hearing gets better with age as the technology exponentially improves. He's part of this seamless fusion of biology and technology, or what's known as singularity, which is the point in the future where biology and technology fuse for all of us, potentially even creating eternal life. Imagine in the synagogue or in the church or in your mosque when somebody asks you, do you take this person for life? How threatening that's going to be, because we're talking centuries and thousands of years potentially. Because of artificial intelligence and the exponentiality of artificial intelligence, we're now at the knee of the curve when things start moving really quickly. Who thinks that the world's moved really fast in the last 10 years? Yet we're smarter today than we'll be tomorrow compared to the big data that is available in the world tomorrow. Aren't you happy they sort of kicked things off here with an inspirational speaker? And according to this timescale, 2015 was the year when computing power trumped the brain power of a mouse. Amazing technological novelty, right? But already, because of exponentiality, that's going to trump the brain power of a human in 2023 in Norway. It's going to take a little bit longer in Sweden and Australia and forward-looking countries. Any Norwegians that I've totally offended here today? All right, this is kind of part of our national duty as Swedes to do. This is not science fiction, ladies and gentlemen. This is the mathematics of something doubling. And what I get concerned about necessarily when we look at exponentiality, it is that as humans, we are so mired into the investment decisions of yesteryear, of generations ago. Things like coal and the future have nothing in common. We can see that solar power, of course, is going exponential, which means the electrification of cars is critical. And what scares me is not necessarily that the machines are learning, it's that as humans, we are so slow at learning. In 1967, the Swedish government decided that we were going to switch from left lane driving to right lane driving. This is still to happen in certain countries around the world because supposedly it's safer. The big change management mantra of the era was just smile. We're all just learning and we're new at this. This is what happens when apes, human apes, are behind vehicles. Absolute chaos. And I wonder then, in a world of the future where my mum describes the digital future as digitally dehumanized, whether in fact a world of technology isn't more humanized, more humane. Because human error, I don't think is very humane, right? And nowadays in humanufacturing or manufacturing, we know that humans commit errors all of the time. Errors that lead to death and misery. So let's compare that to a world enabled with technology. Let me take you to rush hour and let me just get you into a mindset of thinking about what it would be like to send your kids, your nieces, your nephews out on their skateboards on their way to work or to school across this particular intersection. And we can already sense a few technological hearts with a slightly raised elevation at the moment. Now, I was recently in Mumbai, India, working with Bharti Airtel, the telecommunications providers, and one of the C-suite said to me, "Anders, this is nothing new. This is what it looks like on Mumbai streets every day of the week." And yes, we also have cows in those intersections as well, just to make things a little bit more interesting. Of course, this is what's enabled by technology. And in that world, I would say that maybe as humans, we're actually more empathetic, more careful about the people around us. And when this tunes into the smart cities of the future, what we are seeing is that we're all of a sudden working with cities that are breathing smart, thinking smart, in a world where 30% of all pollution from vehicles come from people looking for a car park. Can you imagine how smart cities might actually prevent congestion instead? A world of electrification where we're no longer going to be dictated to by the likes of ISIS and petro-dictators in the Middle East, but instead we're using all of the energies available to us via solar, etc., to make our mobility choices even more sustainable. Just take a look at this exponential world we're now living in. The mass adoption of autonomous vehicles and usage-based car insurance could save 1.1 million lives every year. The cost of 3D printing has dropped by a factor of 400 in the past 7 years. A couple of weeks ago, I was working in Fiji. I know, tough gig. And I was talking to my driver in Fiji and I asked him, "Why do you use your particular car?" And he says, "It's the only car brand in Fiji that has spare parts here." And I go, "How many spare parts does your mechanic have to have?" And he goes, "Hundreds and hundreds." And I go, "Wouldn't it be amazing if that particular car brand and that mechanic instead could 3D print the parts that they need?" Do you think that might open up markets to other brands as well, to make sure mechanics actually run smarter, leaner business models, just like my mum could? Today, industrial robots cost 1/23 of what they did 5 years ago. And again, these are stats from 2015, so it's even lower in an age of exponentiality. What we are now seeing is that smart cities are starting to integrate with the vehicles around us, leading to more sustainability, lower energy costs, and of course the automotive industry has a massive opportunity to play in this smart city of the future, a city that I believe is more humane than the analog world could ever be, more sustainable than the analog world could ever be. At a particular car brand at their factory back in 2009, they asked themselves the societal question of looking to 2020. And they asked themselves, what's the average age of our worker going to be in 2020? And they found that it would be 59 years of age. And at this particular car brand, they thought, what if we created a team of 59-year-olds already back in 2009 to study them anthropologically and see how we could make them more productive to, of course, ensure that their aging for workforce remained engaged and that their output was good. They studied them, and then over time, they noticed that there were some issues which led to them being less productive than their younger peers. They gave them barber chairs, barber stools, better ergonomically tailored shoes, bigger screens. Their defect rate went down to 0, and the productivity was boosted by 9%, which led to this particular initiative of engaging the older workforce to being a company-wide productivity initiative. At the same time, who here in the audience has low hopes that humans are going to do that kind of work in the future? Because robots is doing to our brawns what AI is doing to our brains. And this leads to societal questions where in the United States, for example, there's now a disconnect between engaged and increasing levels of productivity, but that is now decoupled from jobs growth. Over history, we've always seen productivity and jobs growth go hand in hand. Yet in the United States, where manufacturing output has been boosted by 40% over the last 20 years, there's 30% less jobs in manufacturing. At the same time, in US manufacturing, what they are seeing is that 2 million jobs over the next 10 years will go unfilled because there's not the technical expertise in the human workforce to fill them. Which means that to ensure that we have humanufacturing in the future, we must invest into human manufacturing skills. Or we might run the risk of having a Luddite revolution 2.0. I sometimes feel like my mum is a reincarnation of Ned Ludd, the person here in the Midlands in the UK who led the revolution against textile machines, who smashed textile machines in an effort to maintain jobs for humans. This is not what we want in our society. My mum always describes the future as digitally dehumanized, yet let me use an example of where the automotive industry can be humanufacturing focused and focused on our human well-being. And I should just apologize here for using this particular example. If anyone has loved ones, acquaintances that were impacted by these two particular events, I do apologize. And I do think it's an illustrative example of the impact of the automotive industry positively for the future. The truck on your left was the truck that was used in the 2016 Nice Bastille Day attack, where the ISIS-inspired perpetrator, through human error, let's call it that, was able to take that dumb truck and drive it for 1.6 kilometers down the esplanade in Nice before he was stopped by human bullets. 1.6 kilometers, over 90 people dead, 480 people still suffering injuries from that attack, many more impacted by post-traumatic stress disorder. The truck on your right was built after an EU directive in 2012, which stated that every truck on the roads of the EU built after 2012 had to be part of the Internet of Things, had to be equipped with sensors, had to be equipped with ABS systems that would automatically detect human suffering. Foolishly, the perpetrator during the Berlin Christmas market attack last year used that particular truck to hijack. He still had his foot on the accelerator. However, after 70 meters, the truck would not move. The truck shut him down. He had the intention to keep driving that truck, yet he couldn't work it out. And I think in that way, the digital world enabled by technology can actually be more humane. Yes, there was still human suffering, and some of you might ask, yes, but Anders, maybe in the future ISIS doesn't actually have to send someone to hijack a car, they can just send a piece of code instead. Yes, we are now liable in an age of the Internet of Things towards all of our devices being hacked, be they our baby monitors, for example, or whatever happens in your smart homes of the future. But the pressure is on us as human beings to constantly code for humanity, to code for a humane future where we engage in new ways. The Internet of Things enables us to have a new conversation with the things around us, where brands have gone from a sort of unilateral communication with us as consumers to, through the Web 2.0 era, being able to have a dialogue with us as humans. But now objects, like the classic E-Type, will be able to have a conversation with us in real time. We'll be able to tell that based upon it integrating with your smart home and your smart fridge, the milk at home is off, which means while you're at work, it can make sure that it drives away, picks up fresh milk, and you'll get brownie points when you get home to your loved ones, your wife, your husband. This is the future, of course, where we'll be able to have a tripartite conversation. Now, this future scares my mother. And she reminds me in many ways of this quote from Douglas Adams, the great science fiction author, who said that anything new or anything that's in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary, and it's just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between the ages of 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary. And yes, you can probably get a career in it, like a philosophical, ethical coder for automotives for the future. Anything invented after the age of 35 is against the natural order of things. And given that I turned 36 just earlier this year, I'm really afraid of Snapchat. And occasionally my mum will send me little digital YouTube videos to prove to me that the good old days truly were the good old days, sometimes more passively aggressively or aggressively. Little digital YouTube videos will appear, and here's something she just recently sent to me.
Emma. Huh? Emma.
Not anymore.
Emma.
Every day it's getting on my nerves.
Emma.
Oh, I'm
Emma.
begging
Emma.
Clearly my role as the futurist to kind of lower the intellectual rigor here of the conversation. Second point before we wrap up. We are now as consumers all craving seamless transformation. So indulge both with our digital minds but also with our analog hearts. I believe the future is not just of humanufacturing where we have human error, but instead of humanufacturing, where we look at the beneficial, the benevolent impacts of humans in the manufacturing chain, but also from a customer experience perspective. And what we all need to do, and why I love brands like Jaguar Land Rover, is that as heritage brand, as tradition brands, they are able to weave a story from the past to the present to the future. And they're able to engage with us just as you should and your stakeholders should, to ensure that they realize that the customer experience journey of the future is not one that's just linear, but it goes across analog touch points from awareness to engagement to evaluation to decision and then usage and loyalty. We all have to design better customer journeys of the future. A brand close to my heart is a brand called Icebreaker, a New Zealand brand based on merino textiles that enable us to stay cool during hot New Zealand summers or and warm during cold New Zealand winters. Easy to say if you're Swedish. Now they saw new consumer habits, just like my mum a few years ago. What they decided to do, given that they were in the industry of sheep, like so many New Zealanders are, they thought, why don't we create our own barcode instead? They literally call it a barcode. Barcode. Okay, 3 people got that. Fantastic. And now when you're in front of a particular item, you just scan that barcode and all of a sudden the entire supply chain, all the way through from producer to consumer comes alive. You get an insight into the mechanical and textile properties of the threads that you wear. You get introduced to the people behind the brand geocontextually, and you can see where the textile threads of what you wear actually come from. You get told a story of the 3rd generation sheep farmer in New Zealand who looks after his or her sheep, their families. This connects both with our digital minds, but also importantly with our analog hearts as consumers. And I believe increasingly in the future when it comes to humanufacturing, what we have to do and what the consumer will increasingly care about is the artisanal, the craftsmanship, the importance of investing in factories both in Coventry and the Midlands, but ensuring that we tell a story of the humans behind the humanufacturing. We are already obsessed with ideas like fair trade, and increasingly we're going to see this permeating through the automotive industry as well. Knowing that the goods that we buy or the automotives that we purchase or that we gain access to via car sharing have a beautiful human story to tell as well. That they are investing in the future of humanufacturing skills of their human workers as well. A world that's moving away from yesterday's tired reality, where customer journeys are disjointed, indifferent, fractured, effortful, out of context, generic, irrelevant, complex, focused on demographics feels tired and instead moves to a world that's combinatorial, empathetic with us as humans, omni-channel, effortless, contextual, personal, relevant, simple, focused on psychographics of one or a couple, is wide and a little bit magical. In the future, it's going to be impossible to claim that you as a brand are customer-centric without being extremely data-centric. Now, futurists don't leave you with 3 bullet points that are silver bullets to solve your future, because we believe that ends cognitive inquiry. Rather, I want to leave you with this question. Imagine that it's now 2020, and on your watch, your company, your publication, your brand went belly up. What were the trends that you just missed? What were the signals that you deliberately chose to ignore? And what were the investment decisions into yourself that you just delayed and delayed that led to that demise? And instead, as a journalist, as a media amplifier, what change will you make today to prevent that from happening? Now, some of you might ask, and courtesy, by the way, of Jaguar Land Rover, all the slides are available for you. If you want to also print them out to soothe your analog soul, feel free to do that as well. Some of you might ask, Anders, whatever happened to your mum's little shop in Stockholm, Sweden? Well, my mum is now starting to show that even old dogs can learn new tricks. She's dipping her toes into the digital water, learning that you have to be first digital on the inside so that you can also be digital on the outside. Learning to connect across the generations to an increasingly savvy consumer. Recently, we teamed up with a small Swedish digital player called Spotify, you might have heard of it, to see if we could help my mum stop singing in the shower, but rather amplifying her story, her brand, to teach something as simple as doing the perfect little pocket square, taking the intergenerational wisdom of something a great-grandfather once did, but giving it relevant also for his great-grandson. Nowadays, the history and the future, as well as the present, sit side by side. The provenance, the textiles, the stories, the black and white history now gets electrified. And as a family business, we've recently digitized one of our family members to ensure that she has relevance in a multicolored future as well. We've recently digitized my brother as a cheap male model. He does a great Zoolander blue steel. And nowadays, digital touch points and analog touch points give the customer an experience of the brand that's both digital and analog, showing that you don't have to throw away the analog history or the baby with the digital bathwater. And I want to encourage you, as you think about the automotive industry, the mobility revolution moving forward, that you come up with rip-snorting ideas that combine both the best of yesteryear as well as the future. Start preparing for that future today, because, ladies and gentlemen, it is where you're going to spend the rest of your lives. Thank you very much for hanging out here. All the best in the future. Thank you.